in order to begin our program tonight, we would like to acknowledge that we at the Kluge-Ruhe are on the land of the Monacan Nation, and we like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Since many of you are joining from different locations around the world, I would like to also acknowledge the Indigenous nations where you all are, where we're all joining from. And I encourage you to learn about the Indigenous people in your area and their art and their culture. So without further ado, we have our first webinar of our new exhibition. We're back open by reservations. It's so exciting. Our new exhibit is called From Little Things, Big Things Grow. It's curated by the three panelists we have today, and I'm going to hand it over to Henry Skerritt, who's our curator at the Kluge-Ruhe. Thanks, Henry.
Thank you so much, Vanilla. All right, so can we get a PowerPoint up, Addie? So it's so nice to be here. Those of you in Australia, and I can see there's quite a lot of you, the weather in Monacan country is just perfect at the moment. It's such a shame we can't have you all come and visit. So those of you who don't know me, I'm the Curator of Indigenous Arts of Australia at the Kluge-Ruhe. I also teach in the art history department. I'm an art historian. I grew up in a little country town on the west coast of Australia called Perth. And I guess all of you here probably already know this, but UVA has an extraordinary collection, one of the finest collections of Aboriginal Australian art outside of Australia, and we are the only museum outside of Australia dedicated to the presentation and research of Indigenous Australian art. And right now we have about 2,500 works in the collection. We are trying to grow it every day. And those works range from masterpieces of early bark painting through to epic abstract works like the ones you can see on the screen, through to photography, ceramics, video art, you name it, we got it. And you know, when I talk about that, that really does bring up this first part of this presentation, right? This is a behind the scenes presentation on curating land rights, art, and innovation. And you know, one of the questions I often get is, what is a curator, right? Now I'm sure, you know, most of you already know this, but you know, this word curator, it comes from the Latin word to care, and originally it was somebody who cared for collections, right? And that's still something that we do to an extent. The care that we give them is growing them, I suppose. But today, really, when people talk about curating, they've really come to mean exhibition making. Some curators have even stopped using the term curating and had preferred to call themselves exhibition makers. And I spend a lot of time thinking about curating, particularly because my position as somebody who both teaches and curates really often makes me ask, you know, what is the benefit of having a curator who teaches or having a museum at a university? And so, you know, one of the thinkers who's been very influential on me is Paul O'Neill, and Paul O'Neill says of a curator that, and this is a great book, by the way, I would highly recommend it, because I'm a teacher, I'm allowed to give you a reading list and say you should all go and read this book. It's perilously dense, but only short. But Paul O'Neill, he sketches this history in this book of curating. In the first half of the book, he's talking about these curators who emerge, who really are, you know, auteurs. They're the kind of curators who come in and demand things of the artists and force, you know, exhibitions in the kind of, you know, dictatorial way. And O'Neill, he doesn't really see that as a good thing, right? He sees that over time, curating becomes this collaborative process. He calls it collaborative, dialogic, open-ended. And so this is my favorite quote in the book. He says, rather than texts waiting to be read, exhibitions have the potential to activate discursive processes that enable dialogical spaces of negotiation between curators, artists, and their public. Now, he's obviously a curator and not an editor, because that's a very wordy and somewhat clunky paragraph, but the idea is good, right? The idea is that curators are not just people who make these exhibitions like dictators like, Godard and Truffaut crafting their films, but rather they're people who activate these spaces of dialogue. Okay, so we've got this idea that exhibitions are this space that he has between curators, artists, and publics. And I've been thinking about that a lot, and as a teacher, started to think that really there's another space in there. And as a research institution at Kluge-Ruhe, I've started thinking, well, if curating is to be a meaningful exercise, curating has to be considered its own form of research. That in this process of curating, there is new knowledge that can emerge. And I've come to realize that that's very much the philosophy that we've taken at Kluge-Ruhe towards our role as a teaching and learning institution. I have the next slide. Right. So, I often joke that as a curator, I'm the curator that never curates anything. And I say that because really what's driven me as a curator in the last 5 years has been thinking about the curatorial exercise as a space in which communities can curate and you can curate communities. And what I mean by that is multiple, right? That we've tried really hard to facilitate exhibitions where students could work collaboratively to curate with artists, or in a broader sense with exhibitions like Murray and 8 Decades of Aboriginal Australian Bark Painting from Yirrkala, which opens at the Hood Museum in September 2022. We've been working very close with the community at Yirrkala to curate their own narrative. And what I'm getting at here is that at Kluge-Ruhe, I think as this international outpost for Aboriginal Australian art, we're in this unique position where we can bring together these communities, students, the public, Indigenous communities, and enable these international spaces of cross-cultural dialogue, right? And I think that for us, that's just not just a nice idea, but it's really both a moral and intellectual imperative. And it's vital if we're going to think about how we as people and students that we're trying to teach are able to navigate an increasingly polarized world of different cultures, creeds, and belief systems. I feel really touched that actually in the audience there's a couple of former interns who've also curated works, curated exhibitions, and been involved in curating at Kluge-Ruhe. So a little shout out to Gabby Fuller and Eleanor Newman, who are both in the audience. So this is the curatorial philosophy. This is what we're working on, an idea that curating can be a space of research that brings together people from all ages, walks of life, cultures, and now with Zoom, we're able to cross borders even more efficiently. So, that's to lay down the background of the idea of curating at Kluge-Ruhe and my curatorial philosophy and the philosophy that guides us here. But I think you'll really want to hear about this exhibition, From Little Things, Big Things Grow. Now, those of you in Australia, I'm sure, will know that we pinched the title from Kev Carmody and Paul Kelly, who in 1991 recorded one of the most anthemic pieces of protest song ever recorded in Australia. And they wrote the song From Little Things, Big Things Grow, inspired by the story of Vincent Lingiari, who in 1966 led Aboriginal station workers in a strike against the wealthy landowners, Lord Vestey of Wave Hill Station. And, for us, this idea, it really encapsulated an awful lot about the Aboriginal art movement. Now, I think we all know Aboriginal art is about the land, but often I think the very political nature of this is overlooked. One of the things that we hear so often from visiting artists is that their works are not just pretty pictures, but they are, in fact, as Jumbo Marawili says, title deeds to ancestral country. But what I think is often overlooked in this is how much these two movements, art and politics, have really gone hand in hand, particularly in the second half of the 20th century. In fact, it's almost impossible to divorce the great moments of innovation in art with those of great moments of innovation in, of great moments of advancement in the land rights movement. I have my next slide. So, with this in mind, this exhibition was, as it was formulating, really came up together with two kind of, like a kind of two strands, like a DNA helix, like kind of circling around each other. And for me, these two works, which are in the first gallery of the exhibition, really speak to that, right? On the left, we have a work from 1961 by the great Mungarawai Yunupingu, who, in 1961 was one of the small group of men at Yirrkala who were coming together to paint the church panels and then the bark petition, which was really, one of the first sparks of the land rights movement. And it's kind of lovely to think that, we've got Mungarawai here represented with a painting which is about the ancestral crocodile Wallaroo taking the fire from Yatikba to Nullarbor. So, this spark is travelling. And then next to that, we have Brenda Croft's Jinparak, which recounts her journey as a Gurindji person returning to Wave Hill Station and remaking the narrative from the debris that she finds. Here she's found a cup made from an old baked beans tin, surrounded with the remnants of the station. So we were really playing with these two ideas, and I felt really, really lucky as I was sort of tossing these ideas about, that I was blessed with two extraordinary curatorial co-conspirators who were prepared to share this journey. And they were Ashley BOTKIN and Addie Patrick, who were, at the time we started this exhibition, in their final year at UVA. And it was such an incredible pleasure to work with two young curators who were so clearly committed to the craft and so clearly committed to this idea that curating could reveal new insights and create, some really interesting new conversations. So I felt very, very lucky. And so before we get onto those big conversations, which I think the results, for those of you who've seen this exhibition, really are testament to their efforts, I'd sort of like to open it up to them to ask sort of how they saw the process of curating from Little Things, Big Things Grow.
So as Henry said, I'm Ashley. I just graduated from UVA. I was a religious studies and art history major.
Oh, and I'm Addie.
My dear friend Addie.
Yes. Hi, I'm Addie. Also just graduated from UVA as an anthropology and French double major, and had the pleasure to intern with Ashley throughout our entire fourth year.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing. I loved working with Addie. It was funny because we actually worked together our second year in a different class on a different museum project. And then we were able to come back together our fourth year to do this. And we work really, really well together, and we work really well with Henry. So we hope that everyone can get in to see this exhibit. But we were highly involved with the curatorial process with this exhibit. We did a lot of stuff like make Instagram videos for the Instagram, in which we have some here that show kind of the early planning stages that go into putting together an exhibit. So Addie, if you'd like to play those.
Yes. So both of these videos took place in February, sort of right before COVID hit the fan and things had to change a little bit. But this kind of shows, yeah, the very early stages. Oh no, wait, hang on. Okay.
So this upcoming exhibit celebrates 21 years of collecting at the Kluge-Ruhe, and it celebrates learning, teaching, and collaboration between women, men, and then women and men in this room.
So do you want to talk a little bit about what was happening in that video?
Yeah, so what was there is called a maquette, which is it's like the French word for like a little plan, like a miniature version is how we use it. So that was basically a very scaled down version of the 3 galleries that we were using for this exhibit. And we cut out these little itty bitty pictures of what the paintings or pieces of art would look like, and then we stick them up to the little walls of the maquette so we can kind of plan out what will fit where. We print out the paintings to size. I'm sorry, my cat is getting into something back here. And so that's what we were doing in that video. And originally we were focusing one room specifically on women, another room specifically on men, and then another one about their relationship working together. But as we'll talk about later, that kind of evolved. One of our rooms is still about women, but the other 2 rooms, when we kind of figured out what we wanted our narrative to be and what pieces would be available, that all moved with it. So it's a very fluid process, and a lot of things that we were putting on the walls of our maquette did not end up being in the final exhibit, but that's just how curating works, especially with Aboriginal art.
Yeah, so in this next video, you'll see a little preview of what didn't end up going in the exhibit, so I'll just show you the video first.
Okay, so one aspect that we're really excited about is showcasing some of our older items from our older collection. Like these are all small bark paintings from Groot Island, which is from the original Kluge-Ruhe donation. And then if you turn the...
Okay, so in the video you can kind of see that I'm a little unsure about what I'm talking about. But you can see in that video that we had we had picked out, Ashley and I, in the Kluge-Ruhe's collection, a bunch of small bark paintings, some of the oldest work that the Kluge-Ruhe has, and we were really excited to showcase this older material. But what ended up happening is a question that we never really had to consider, particularly in our previous curatorial experience, which was a very history-based, much more American exhibit. We didn't have to consider sort of the condition of the items in the collection. So particularly with these Groot Island barks, bark paintings, as we'll talk about a little bit later, there are some bark paintings in the exhibit, but bark paintings are expensive to kind of maintain, and so they take time and money in order to make sure that they are ready to show. So in this particular case, we didn't really have the resources and the time particularly to do all of these Groot Island works. So we sort of had to think about other things and address kind of these questions that we didn't really have to think about. And there are some other works that, if you know a lot about Indigenous art, you might have recognized in the maquette that didn't make it into the show, but we are incredibly excited to talk about the things that did make it into the show.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next slide.
Yeah, so we actually got into we stuck our hands in many pies, if I may. We not only helped with this exhibit, we helped with an exhibit that went up in the rotunda. We were able to curate our own mini exhibit that went on a plinth in one of the UVA libraries. And we were able to help with the gigantic exhibit of 112 memorial poles that went in at the Fralin Museum of Art called The Inside World. So we've been interviewed for videos, we've been able to handle pieces of art. We're published researchers, I guess you could say. because we have a few catalogs out. You can see like one of the catalogs down there in the bottom right, that was for the Rotunda show. Addie and I were lucky enough to be able to research some new works, and as well as help edit some of our peers' writings. The Inside World Memorial polls are in the bottom left. That was 112 polls, is a lot to keep track of, and we had to draw these little itty bitty maps with little circles everywhere. We were always rearranging things, trying to keep track of what went where, trying to label everything because things would get moved, you know, just a millimeter and it would throw off your map drawing. So we've been busy for the year that we were able to work on this. So not only were we doing this current project from Little Things Big Things Grow, but we were also, you know, doing a bunch of other curatorial activities that were honestly really amazing.
Yeah, and I will say, so a lot of the curatorial work that we did is rather universal across museums, you know, some publicity, booklets, displays, where do things go. But in working with Aboriginal art specifically, we had to kind of face some challenges that you wouldn't have to face in a museum that was displaying different works of art, different types of art from elsewhere. Basically, as Henry hinted at earlier, us as curators are traditionally, you know, in the, I don't know, traditional art of curators, the curator is like the master of the exhibit. They decide, you know, they have all the knowledge, they decide where everything's going to go. But in no way were Ashley, Henry, or I, you know, the custodians of this knowledge in any of the exhibits that we did. We always had to defer to the Aboriginal artists, many of whom, you know, some not living, many still living, and a lot that came to visit the show and see their works in person, as particularly with the Inside World and the Rotunda show. So we had to sort of be humble in our curatorial endeavors and take a step back and listen a lot to the authorities in the room about where things should go, the language we should use, language we definitely shouldn't use, in order to share this culture that seems a little, at first glance, out of place in Charlottesville. So understandably, a lot of our visitors might not have really any previous exposure to Indigenous art. We want to share that with them in a way that is respectful and in a way that is true to what the artist's intentions were in creating the work. So that has been an exciting and difficult challenge, but incredibly rewarding. So we were able to kind of stretch those muscles in all the different projects that we did. Yeah, I don't know, Ashley, if you have other things to add to this.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with Addie, because I mean, and even there's certain things about Aboriginal art that we as non-Aboriginal people will never know, but which I think is an amazing aspect of Aboriginal art. You know, there's a certain amount of knowledge that Aboriginal people, you know, from the different groups might have that we do not. And it was very amazing and humbling, I would say. It's not like you can just open a book and learn about Cubism or something like that, you know, some sort of Western art movement. You really have to dive in deep. There will be meanings, like layers upon layers upon layers of meaning, some that you know, may never know, may never be able to know. And that was one of my favorite parts about working on this show and all the other shows that we did too.
Yeah.
Thanks. I'm really glad you brought up some of these photos, because it reminds me, you know, it's really easy in September to be thinking about how isolated we all are. But in that year that we were working, we had Gabriel Marilyn Gura and Joe Goimala come, and Barbara Moore and Kent Morris as well, I think, in that time. And it was, you know, one of the things that was really, I found really impressive was both of your abilities to engage with artists. I'm thinking here of sitting at the College Inn with Ashley and Addie ordering for Barbara Moore and Sharon Adamson and explaining, oh, you don't necessarily eat salads in a diner, and yeah, those sort of you know, but I think that ability to get the, you know, cultural exchange and to kind of recognize the knowledge holders in the room, I thought, you know, it was a really rewarding thing to watch.
Can you guys just tell us the name of the Rotunda exhibit, which is that catalog sitting there, because it's a little too small for us to read? Can you? Have I stumped you?
Mungoi Mungoi.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mungoi Mungoi, which means
Forever.
forever. In Gumingu.
Yeah, and I want to add one more thing also to this slide. Thinking about the visiting artists, we also had Brian Robinson, who came in February, right before things shut down. And what was really great about Brian, so his show was in the smaller gallery. If you've visited the Kluge-Ruhe, that's behind the front desk. And so he's from the Torres Strait Island, and he's also a curator. So we were able to, he curated that show, and we got to look at his labels and suggest some edits. But again, we were not the lead curators. We sent those edits back to him, and he made the final changes, and the show was his, and we just showed it. And we're so thankful that he was able to come and, you know, give talks to various classes at UVA, make a little bit of art at the Kluge-Ruhe, and share his work. And we were able to learn from him too.
And I think he gave his 2 cents on the original maquette as well, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yes, he did. He helped us with that.
We have a question that's sort of pertinent to this, which is, how does the distance between Virginia and the Aboriginal artists and their communities, how does that affect working with them and getting appropriate decisions and permissions? Can you talk to that?
That's a big question, you know, and I mean, it's quite interesting. You know, I feel a little bit embarrassed to have Audrey wander on camera, but one of the reasons that she does that is that she's quite used to me sitting here on Zoom at 7 p.m. because I am most nights, and she'll usually pop her head around and say, "Oh, hey, Woken, hey, Yinamala," you know, it's an incredible difficulty that we have because of distance. But we have been really, you know, with exhibitions like this, before anything goes up, we are clearing it with the art centres that represent artists as best we can. In some instances, it's really hard. You know, in the first slide, we showed this amazing painting by Pulperu Davies, which was donated to the collection by Richard Klingler and Jane Slatter last year. And, you know, it took an awful lot of work to find out where Pulperu Davies was, because she has unfortunately left the community where she was living, and then she moved to an aged care facility in a remote region, and then finally she's now in Port Hedland. So, you know, it trying to find, you know, some of that information and trying to find some of those approvals is very, very difficult. It's difficult if you're in Perth or Sydney or Melbourne, let alone Charlottesville. But you know, we try our best, I think, is the answer. And I think this is a good point, I think, to maybe move on to the exhibition and talk about some of the strategies for doing that in the exhibition.
Sure. So, okay. So now Ashley and I have talked a little bit about some of the curatorial work that we've done. So we want to move now into talking more specifically about the show that's currently on display until May, and we encourage you to see it if you can, because it's much more beautiful in person, if you can believe it. From Little Things, Big Things Grow. So we're going to start with Gallery C, which Ashley and I affectionately refer to as the purple room, simply because it has a purple wall. So Gallery C is sort of the unofficial entryway into the exhibit. Before we had COVID procedures in place, you could technically go in through the other gallery that showcases another exhibit and then maybe meander your way through this room. But because we have COVID procedures in place where you go in one way and come out the other, this is the first room you see in the exhibit. So from a curatorial standpoint, that played a role in the pieces that we eventually decided to show in here. So this is also the room that has the text label that explains some of the foundational stuff that Henry talked about in the beginning, the walk-off and Vincent Lingari, and sort of the explanation about the title of the show. And we also have here, in terms of a Western understanding of chronological history, some of our older works, which are these 3 bark paintings that you see on the image, the picture on the right. And so what I want to do to talk a little bit more about the themes and dive a little bit more into the complexities of the works is to talk about, if I can make my slide go next, these 2 bark paintings, which introduce some themes that you see throughout the exhibit, but especially address kind of this idea of generational sharing, this idea of ancestral knowledge passing on from one generation to the next, both in terms of themes, but also in terms of art style, and also in terms of renownedness, I'll say. So I'm going to start with the image, the bark painting on the right. This is Imagine Them, the Black Wallaroo by Peter Marawanga. This work, and for those that don't know what a wallaroo is, because I didn't know what a wallaroo was, it's an intermediate animal, mid-size, in between a kangaroo and a wallaby. Okay, so clear that out of the way. So this bark painting depicts an ancestral story. It on the top left corner, you can see this humanoid figure, which is a Mimi spirit, an ancestral spirit that is known to have given the people in Peter Marawanga's community art, dance, hunting, those type of skills. And the Mimi is currently hunting and killing this Black Wallaroo for food. So this ancestral story is part of the Kunwinku ceremony. It's a story that's been passed down from generation to generation, and it's an ancestral story that makes up the land in which Peter Marawanga grew up in. And so what's significant about this story, or about this work, there's 2 things. So there's the ancestral story, which showcases the Peter Marawanga's sort of ownership of this land and his knowledge of this ancestral story. So when we talk about land rights, we think about this Western understanding of land and deeds and mortgages and titleships. The Indigenous understanding land it's much more, in a way, it's simpler, because the land simply belongs to them because it birthed them. They know the stories, and because they know the stories of how the land was made, the land is their country. So this knowledge is much deeper, is much older than any mortgage deed, than any colonial history of Australia. So we have this knowledge, which is represented here in this story. But in terms of the artistic technique itself, we also have an interesting feature here, which I can't zoom in, but the thin lines that make up the body of the Wallaroo and the Mimi are called rark, which is this cross-hatching design. And it's a ceremonial design. It's a sacred design. And Peter Marawanga learned this from his mentor, Yirawala, and sort of replaced previous ways of depicting ancestral beings with this sacred design, again, emphasizing the ancestral knowledge that he has of this land. So turning to the image on the left, we have John Maranjole's work, Drought de Lebang, which is a very famous work. It was displayed in multiple museums in Australia, and so we're very thankful that we have it here at the Kluge-Ruhe and can show it to you guys. So this story, so to back up, John Maranjole was learned art from Peter Marawanga. So he learned this rark design. He learned stories from Peter Marawanga as a mentor, the same way that Peter Marawanga learned from Yirawala. So we have this generational passing down of knowledge. But John Maranjole has sort of put his own spin on this story here. So we have a different ancestral story depicted in this painting. We have the story of ancestors that have gone to this waterhole, this small lake, which was the residence of Nagalyad, the rainbow serpent. And so Nagalyad kills the ancestors, and he turns their bones into rocks, and these rocks stay red, which indicates that Nagaliad is always looking over them, is always watching over them, and sort of indicates as well that the ancestors are always living in this land, that are the land. So in the work itself, you can see the faces of the ancestors as they make up the land. And we also have this cross-hatching mark that makes up the land as well, the ceremonial design that further emphasizes this very deep-rooted, embedded connection that John Maranjole has to this land and the sacredness of this site. So stepping back, we have this idea again of Indigenous knowledge as something that is separate from Western knowledge of land, but which is used in order to basically prove and counteract the Western knowledge of land, this colonial knowledge of land as something you own. And we have a colonial narrative that comes into play in another work in this same room by Queenie Mackenzie. This is a recent acquisition to the Kluge-Ruhe, and we're very thankful to have it. It looks on the outset much more abstract, but it addresses similar themes, and as we'll see. So Jack Kelly's Rock Hole is the name of the painting, and in order to kind of get a better understanding of what this painting is depicting, there's two things to know. The first is the ancestral story sort of at play here. So the story of this rock hole is, again, we have two ancestors, an old man and woman, who were married and in love, and they died at this spot and turned into rocks. And the rocks created this beautiful, everlasting waterfall, this rock hole. And so we have this ancestral story about how this rock hole came to be. And then we have a much more modern story that is relevant to Queenie Mackenzie's personal life. So she's from the Gija people, and her relatives were under the colonial rule of this man named Jack Kelly. So Jack Kelly was a stockman who is sort of like a cowboy, and he was given 1,000 square miles of land from the colonial government, and was given the land to raise cattle, that type of thing. And he basically had Indigenous people working for him. And it's a very violent story because he was very violent towards his workers, and was known for killing his workers and essentially spilling blood on this land that is incredibly sacred to the Gija people. So in this painting, we have this story of love, of eternal love, of longevity, and we have this much more recent story of colonialism, of violence, of abuse that is layered on top of this land. So it just goes to show the very deliberate layering, I guess, of land, but also the very intricate complexities of land and the history of this land, but also the continuous, everlasting, eternal, I guess, understanding of this land to the Gija people, as they know what this land always was and always will be, regardless of the things that happen to it. Okay. I don't know, Ashley, if you want to take Gallery D, or if there's any questions or corrections about the previous couple slides.
I just loved listening to that, Addie. That was awesome. And, people, you have to come and see this show, because, that Queenie Mackenzie, that image, which is a perfectly fine image, but it just doesn't do justice to, like, how much depth the kind of opacity of the ochres gives that painting. It's just gorgeous and tragic and layered and incredible.
Yes, and the texture in that one is crazy. It's something that you can't, see over the computer screen, unfortunately. But yeah, definitely get in there to see it. So the next gallery is Gallery D, which we refer to as the yellow room, again, because the wall is yellow. So Gallery D is focusing a lot on what people might consider more traditional art forms, and then how they've evolved, you know, with Aboriginal art, how Aboriginal art has evolved, and then how these traditional ancestral practices, these like weaving, for example, that you see in the left picture, or shield making that you see in the right picture, how, you know, this has really moved into a contemporary art space. So if you want to hit it, Addie. This is one of my favorite pieces in the whole collection, because I know how hard it is to glass blow. This is called Yellow Rush's Fish Basket #2 by Jenny Kimura. And yeah, it's amazing because glass blowing is so difficult, especially if you can see, you know, especially in the second image on the right, how many colors are in there and how she really was able to weave them all together. That is extremely difficult. And one of the things I love about Jenny is she involves in her work something that she calls grandmother's law, which she grew up, you know, watching women in her family weave these baskets. As you can kind of see, for example, we have some beautiful baskets in the image on the left, and it's really a collaborative work. You know, you're not sitting there weaving by yourself, you're weaving with other women, you're weaving with other women in your family. And in the same way, glass blowing is also very collaborative. It's pretty much impossible to glass blow by yourself. You have to have someone else to open the doors for you to fire it. You have to have someone, you know, maybe spinning while you're blowing. So this is, the glass blowing is collaborative, the weaving is collaborative. It's also intergenerational. You will, for example, Jenny learned this weaving, you know, from her family. You learn the glass blowing from other glass blowers in your community. Knowledge is passed down through example, usually orally. So that's why she calls it grandmother's law, because it's this knowledge that you're getting, you know, from the women in your family that she got through her aunts and her mother and her grandmother. So, and again, I really can't believe, and it's pretty big too. You really have to come see it because it is especially hard to get a piece of glass that big without breaking it. Yeah, I'm really amazed by how large it is. And another thing that Jenny does in her studio space is that she teaches in the same kind of way, in the same grandmother's law kind of this grandmother's law way, in that her glass blowing studios, she brings young artists in and older artists, experienced and non-experienced in glass blowing, in order to help this art to last for generations, essentially the same way this weaving has lasted for generations among these Aboriginal people. So we'll go on to the next one, which this is also a really cool corner in the exhibit because it shows progression, which I think is so cool to see. These are both by the same person, Jimmy Nami. And he was an extremely influential artist. He was one of the first generation of desert painters at Balgo, which, if you can see there on the little map of Australia, the little purple dot, that's about where we're located. And in the 1960s and 1970s, these desert artists started painting. They were encouraged by the Catholic missionaries that were in the area. And this led them to found the first art center in the area, the Balgo, at Balgo, and in 1985. So if we look over at the right image called The Fight, this was from 1985. It's one of the first paintings by Jimmy Nami at this art center. And if you look at it, there's a lot of color. It's very expressive. If we look over to the left side, this is Papar, south of Yaga Yaga in the Great Sandy Desert, painted in 1994. this was actually the last painting that Jimmy Nammy did, and it was laid on his casket at his funeral. So if we compare the two images, we can really see how his style of painting has evolved. He's still using these same basic ideas. You know, we're seeing the circles that are connected, and we're seeing these little itty bitty dots. But then as you're looking at the left painting, it almost gets tighter, it gets cleaner in a way. So you're seeing how this art style has evolved amongst, and not only in this one person, but like amongst the desert painters at Balgo, which I think, you know, to see that progression in two works that we own, especially from the same person, you know, to see his whole life essentially in front of us, what he's gone from, I think is really powerful.
I think too, it's a curatorial choice. Similarly with the John Maranjole and Peter Marawanga works that are close to each other, if we were just showing one work of Jimmy Nammy, you might come to different conclusions. Whereas as opposed to having these two side by side, or having this one in one room and one in the other room. So it's another thing to think about as a curator, in the simplest sense. Where do things go? Because that affects where one thing affects how you might interpret another thing in the same room.
Yeah, exactly. We really wanted those two to be beside each other.
So moving now to the last room, which harkens to the video at the beginning of the slideshow. It actually is a room with all female artists. You guessed it, affectionately called the Green Room, Gallery B. So we're going to talk about a couple works in here, but again, if you can, really come see the show, because we can't do all of the works justice with just our words. But
yeah, and they're actually huge. These paintings are huge in person. Yeah, as we're going to say it over and over again, you just have to come see it, because there's nothing else that can really compare, even though those are great images. And yeah, and these are also some of the newest images in the collection, the newest acquisitions that
we are really pleased that we're able to share this with everyone around the world.
Yes, we are.
Okay.
Sorry. because you know, it's just, I feel it's really touching to see so many people from Australia in our audiences, and probably people from all around the country who can't come. So, you know, in some ways, hopefully COVID is bringing us all together in this way, to recognize this extraordinary work.
Yeah, if you can come, you should come. But if you can't, this is the next best thing.
And we're glad you're here.
We are the next best thing.
So in this room, we're just going to talk about a couple pieces, and then we're going to go into our Q&A, keeping an eye on the time a little bit here. So this piece by Emily Kame-Kingware is called Awuya, and this is to start, Emily, as a painter, she started painting later in life. Painting on canvas for women in some areas, you know, was forbidden knowledge, or painting was only for men in some communities, and women expressed their artistic and ancestral knowledge in other forms. So here we have a painting by Emily. Awuya is a word in her language which means, basically refers to the ceremonial body paint designs that they would paint on women. And it also refers to women's knowledge, I have to refer to my notes, excuse me, but women's knowledge of song, dance, traditional medicine, and ancestral narratives. So I chose this painting to show you guys because this painting is just so lovely, and I think it really ties sort of contemporary Western understanding. I said the word Western so many times, but Western understanding of art to Aboriginal art. This painting is very much revered in the Western art world. So not this painting necessarily, but Emily's work. She was the first Australian woman to sell for $1 million at auction, if I have that factoid correct. Her work is really revered as abstract art, but in knowing a little bit more about the piece, you have this blending of the international abstract art movement and this very ancestral knowledge, women's knowledge in this case, of stories and songs and land. And here, one of my favorite things about this work is we know that Emily, when she painted, and as she painted these big splotches of paint on her canvas, she would sing the ceremonial songs, that the same songs that you would sing when you painted these designs on a body. So in a way, this painting here, which is just a flat painting on canvas, is imbued with so much more than just her knowledge, than just a picture of something that might be in her mind. It is, it is her. It has her songs in her. It is her knowledge in more ways than just visual. So it's a great piece, and it does a lot to show the differences in ways to depict this ancestral creation stories, ancestral knowledge. This painting, in comparison to the bark paintings we saw earlier, in comparison to the glass, it's all very different, but they have things that tie them together, and again, things that make them very different from each other.
So this is actually my favorite painting, my favorite piece, my favorite anything in this whole show. Partially because of how absolutely gigantic it is and all of the detail that is in it. So this is called Our Country, and it is by a group of 13 women from Jala Arts. Again, if you see the little map of Australia, you'll see the purple dot about where we're located. So this work, again, by 13 different artists, which if you look at it all as one thing, you may not guess that it's by 13 artists, but as you really start to look at each section of the painting, you can pick out different things that are related to each artist, maybe different motifs that they like to use. So for example, we have this lovely picture of Barbara Moore in the top right corner. She came to visit us. We had a show of her works that were just so amazing. And she also painted a mural in our breezeway. And as you can see, she has this really brushy kind of way of painting. You can really see her strokes in her work. And then if we look in the painting in the top left corner, you see these bright oranges and reds that kind of blend into each other, these large circles. And that's how you can start to pick out, like, oh, that's Barbara's section. That's the part that she worked on. And these women all worked on this painting together. There are pictures of them with this huge canvas laid out on the ground, and they're all sitting around it, working on it at the same time. And this is also a very ancestral knowledge practice, in that maybe an elder woman like Barbara, for example, someone that has more knowledge, more art experience, might be teaching a younger member of the group, helping them discover their own artistic style. And in terms of depictions, it looks very abstract, similar to the painting we just saw, but it references the dreaming, essentially, which is, in English, it's not great to describe. It's not a great term. Dreaming doesn't really describe it well. The word for it is jakurpa. So it's kind of referred to as every when and everywhere. It's something that has happened in the past, it's happened in the future, it's happening now. And powerful ancestors, when they were creating all things during the dreaming, they would walk across the earth and create different features, maybe rocks, as Addie talked about in another story, or a watering hole, or a waterfall. And their trips across the earth where they're recreating these things were called song lines. And this painting shows these women are part of what they're depicting is their song lines, and the way that these 13 women are all connected together. That's something that I really take away from this painting, even if you didn't know what songlines were, or if you didn't know that they were trying to depict togetherness or how they connect with each other. You really get that sense from the painting, the way everything's coming into each other, everything flows into each other. I think, like I said, no, even if you don't know any backstory to this, you can get that sense from seeing it. You can feel what they're trying to emote through this painting, and they're illustrating their connections, and through that we're connected to them too, which I think is, again, part of why it's one of my favorite pieces, because I feel that with them, essentially.
I love that, as really, because that brings us full circle in a way. This painting is so extraordinary, and it's such a major new acquisition for Kluge-Ruhe. We're so lucky to have it here, but it really does speak to the idea that that I was trying to get at the very beginning, that what we have the opportunity to do here at Kluge-Ruhe is to think about ways in which we can make these connections globally, make these connections cross-culturally. And when I'm now thinking back to lunch at the College Inn with Barbara and Sharon, and thinking like that, actually that's exactly what they're trying to tell you in this painting. And it's why the painting is so coherent, because you've got these 13 big personalities all coming together to try and show you actually that they're all one. And it's a very beautiful thing. The way you express it was just fantastic. I think we should throw to some questions though, because we're slowly running out of time. And I think we had one from, we had a question from Gabby Fuller, former curatorial intern and generally an all-round amazing person. And she said, what was your favorite and least favorite parts of working through the curatorial process?
Okay, I can go first. So my favorite part was how much freedom we had in this exhibit. Henry is always busy. I have never not seen him running around trying to do something. And so he gave us a lot of freedom with this exhibit, which I loved. He gave us some pieces. He said, I'd really like to include these. They're new acquisitions. Let's try to get these in. He gave us a title. He had the From Little Things, Big Things Grow idea in the back of his head for a while. But then he said, pick and choose, go through the all the things that we have in the collection, try to piece some ideas together for each room. What's going to tie everything together. So that was definitely my favorite part. My least favorite part, probably how many times we had to edit the text panels. You don't just write these once, you probably write them over like 20 plus times. You write them again, you do all the research. Then other people read them, they rewrite them, you have meetings about it. So that was probably my least favorite part, was having to read the same thing over and over again, but they came out really great. So it was all worth it.
How about you, Eddie?
Yeah, the text label thing, it's a frustration, but it's also a good little insight into the curatorial process that I think maybe the average museum goer does not think about as they walk through and read the text. And as a visitor, when you're reading something on the wall, you assume that is like truthful, you assume that's the truth, and you don't question it. You don't think like, I'm pretty sure I know what this exhibit is, more so than this label. But when you're writing the label, you have to be very, very aware of that you're giving that off. And also you have to be very aware, as I mentioned earlier, about what you're telling these people, because these people, or most people, are going to take it as truth. So that affects the types of things you say, and the audience, the age of the audience also affects the type of words you use. You might walk into some museums and they're very full of words like dialogic, and you might be like, I don't know what that means. Or you might walk into a museum that is more geared towards children that you find to be a little simplistic. so there are a lot of different things to take into account. So yeah, but definitely a difficulty. But my favorite part, so to keep it brief, I think my favorite part and my least favorite part sort of are almost one and the same. My favorite being how much I learned. And just, coming from an anthropological background, you like traditionally learn about different cultures that are very different from your own. So this experience really scratched that itch and allowed me to learn about something I had no prior knowledge about. And it was a really great place to learn that. But then on the flip side and the downside, I guess, is that you can't know it all. And it can be frustrating to try and write something, to try and write a label about an artist when you just don't know everything about them, and maybe you're not meant to know everything about them. That can be frustrating for me, as an academic student that wants to know everything and wants to write my report on the person, and you just can't because there's not enough time, and maybe you don't have enough resources in order to know everything that you can about this one thing, but you just have to share what you know and share it in an honest way.
I think this is another good question. It comes from Eli, and he asks, how do you balance incorporating the desires of the artists with putting your own creativity in an exhibit? And this is a particularly good question, I think, because in the case of curating an exhibition like this, there's a presumption that there's one Aboriginal people, and of course there's not. There's 350 different language groups across the country, and here we've got an exhibition that's bringing all of these groups together. How do you balance? How do you think we worked to balance some of those issues about individual artists, and then what it means to put them in dialogue with other artists?
Henry, he has a second part to that question, which is how do we respond if an individual or community objects to the way we curated something? So that's an interesting second piece.
Well, I mean, that bit's the easy bit. You change it. I mean, that's very easy. But looking at this is an interesting thing, because this was the day we installed this with Regina Wilson's works and the Gapawiak works and the Jenny Kamar Martinello's work. I was sending them all snapshots from my iPhone as they were going up. And I, at least in that little corner, I can say all three, Regina and the community at Gapawiak and Jenny all came back with oh, I'm so glad that I'm nexted. Regina, I love Regina. I love those ladies from Gapawiak. I love, so that was a nice bit, but you don't always have those, you're not always that lucky. I mean, how do you think about these questions, Addie and Ashley?
In terms of our creativity, I really didn't find it difficult to balance my creativity with these artists. It really kind of felt like a dialogue almost, even though I wasn't openly talking to the artist necessarily. I was talking to their work. I was interacting with that. So I felt like I was still able to be creative in terms of kind of choosing themes, maybe what we specifically want to talk about, because the text panels really aren't that large. You really have to choose, something very, very focused to talk about. So I felt like I could be creative in terms of putting things in the exhibit. But again, a lot of it was, letting these artists' works speak to me, and that felt like being a part of their creativity, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, you go, Addie.
I was just going to say, I think, writing labels for this, as limiting as it sometimes can be, these works being so poetic in of themselves, you're allowed to be fairly poetic with the labels, which, you're allowed to be a bit creative with them in the words that you use and the pictures that you try to paint with your words. The other thing that we do that sort of blends the creativity and maybe some of the wishes of the Indigenous artists is we always like to use the quote from the artist in the label. So we, sometimes they might have a quote that pertains to that particular piece that we're showing or that particular art form that we're showing, but oftentimes, they have a few quotes about their artwork in general or their art making practices in general. And so we can, we take the liberty to pick a quote from that we think best represents the work that we're trying to show, or at least the part or the theme of the work that we're trying to draw out.
And I will return to the comment that I made earlier about respectfulness, because, I think that for me, one of the marks of respect in respecting an artist is approaching that artist's work on the level that the artist is offering it, right? And is really to say, what is this art trying to tell me? And one of the things that we hear, you hear over and over and over again from Indigenous artists, why do you paint? Well, I paint because I want to show my culture to the world. I want to show you that the culture is strong. And I think that, what I really found really fantastic working with both of you is that there was a level of respect accorded to each of the artists' work that wasn't just like, well, we were very lucky that Regina's piece and Jenny Kamar's piece were both yellow. That's a little bit neat curating. But they're not just next to each other because they look nice. They're next to each other because they're both asking the same questions, using a different formal language. One's using glass, one's using paint. Here we've got Minawala and her sisters using pandanus to do it. But, I think that when it comes down to that question of, curating or collaborating or facilitating, the thing that I would really hope that is happening here is that questions, that the questions that these artworks are asking are being placed into dialogue with each other in a kind of way that respects the intellectual heft of all of these artists. That, Regina Wilson is a profound thinker about art. John Maranjole, and Peter Marawonga, mentor and apprentice, I guess, people who think very deeply about these questions, and putting them together is not trying to insert a narrative on top of it, but rather to bring out the narrative that they're trying to express, I think. Should we go to one more question?
Yeah, let's. I'm really sorry. There are definitely some questions we're not going to get to, but I think it would be nice to end with a question from a former curator at Kluge-Ruhe, Eleanor. And she asks, in relation to Indigenous art, do you think the term curator will continue to best describe the roles you inhabit at the Kluge-Ruhe? Would another word such as facilitator or collaborator best describe what we still call curator? Or is it just the definition is shifting?
That's a really good one, Eleanor. Yeah, collaborator I do really like, because again, earlier I really did describe, how I feel like I am creatively working, collaborating even with the artists, even though we're not face to face. Yes, I do like collaborator, especially since a lot of the artists, at least in the women's room, are still alive. We've even gotten to meet them, which is a big part of what we do at the Kluge. We're always bringing in artists, always having artist talks. That's a big part of our mission, is being able to have the artists talk about their work themselves. So yeah, I like collaborator actually, but in terms of where curator is going, I don't know yet.
I like this question too. I think that maybe from a realist standpoint, I guess you don't get hired at museums for being a collaborator. You get hired as a curator because you have a degree or experience as a curator. But I think, in all honesty, the definition, at least at the Kluge-Ruhe and hopefully at other places, particularly other Indigenous museums, are changing the definition of curator and what it means to be a curator. I mean, to get all linguistic about it, I think curate does mean in a way like facilitate, but I don't know if the language will need to, if the name of the job will need to change in order to better express sort of what the curators and curatorial interns at the Kluge-Ruhe do, or whether as soon as you hire a new curator, they just have to be sure exactly what they're getting themselves into when they start working at the Kluge-Ruhe. But it's a good
You know, I mean, I think that the great thing about definitions is that we have the power to change them. And that, you know, I mean, that was a question from Eleanor, who was one of the co-curators on Beyond Dreamings. And you know, we've had questions from Gabby Fuller, and having listened to you guys, like, I feel perfectly confident in the state of curation, knowing there are so many great young curators like yourselves emerging. And I think that in the long run, it's people like you two and Eleanor and Gabby and all of the other, you know, amazing collaborators that we've had here working at Kluge-Ruhe who are going to define what that word means. And, you know, we can choose to define it as an author, as somebody who, you know, comes in with an all-powerful top. But I think that the world has become so big that the amount of answers that kind of the amount of answers that kind of curating is going to produce is always going to be limited. I think that, you know, what for me is so great about having the chance to work with people like yourselves, and why I'm constantly going to say, you know, go through and see what you like, is because you're going to find conversations that I'm not going to see. You're going to bring energies that I'm not going to bring. You know, one of the things I've really loved doing is working on the summer program with students who come from all over the country from underrepresented backgrounds, and they bring a totally different angle to the work. And if we want to think seriously about curating as a form of research, it's got to have that collaboration. It's got to have that continual refreshment of new ideas. So, you know, I would just say, Addie, Ashley, Eleanor, Gabby, all of the rest of the curators out there, just redefine that term and make that term mean what it should mean and not what it has meant in the past.
I think that's a great stopping point there, that there's a new generation coming up and we're all gonna be able to stand back and watch you guys do your thing. I want to thank Addie and Ashley for joining us and being such a joy to work with all year. I think I second Henry that it's been a real pleasure. Thank you all.